Well, my name is Keturah Ragland, and I am a PhD student who studies social psychology at Tufts University. My research interests really align with understanding how people who have different marginalized identities sort of show up in spaces and how their different identities impact the way that they move through spaces. And a lot of my work deals with understanding about different cues about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how those cues impact people's perceptions of spaces, as well as sort of if they want to be involved in a space or not.
That's lovely. Tell us a little bit just about yourself and what brings you to being interested in the work that you do.
Yeah, so I have always sort of had a passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, equity, belonging, and inclusion. Um, Throughout sort of like my academic career, I've always tried to put myself in spaces where, I was having those conversations with people about making spaces more equitable. And so that's really continued sort of in my graduate education, in my work, and also sort of in the spaces that I enter. And so I try to do a lot of work, being on various committees in the spaces that I'm in, which is what really sort of drew me to wanting to do my research as well as working with you. Because I was really sort of interested in sort of the actual practicality of how these different practices and theories that we talk about in academic spaces translate into the real world. And so I wanted to not only understand sort of the theoretical conversations regarding these practices regarding equity, belonging, and inclusion, but also see how they are practiced in the real world and sort of ways that we can implement them effectively.
Yeah, that's always the question, right? How does this actually turn into
Exactly.
application? I love it. I mean, yeah, that's what I'm always wondering. I feel like without that, we're missing so much of the point of why we put so much energy into this work, right? That's
Exactly.
awesome. Um, is there anything, and again, you don't have to answer this, I'm just kind of adding into this. Is there anything around your research and the learning that you've done recently that has really continued to push your interest or has created new interests and avenues for you within this work?
Yeah, so in some of my work, what I look at is different types of cues that might sort of either counteract with one another or agree with one another when we are in these spaces regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also questioning sort of practices that we see sort of throughout these spaces and sort of trying to develop an empirical understanding for if they are actually impactful or not, because there is some research that shows that if you have sort of incongruency in cues, such as you tout that you say you really support diversity, equity, and inclusion, but maybe that's not seen in the representation within your organization, or you have practices and things that don't necessarily align with that can actually decrease people's support and feeling for your organization as it regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I really think part of what I'm trying to do is figure out what kind of cues are really important and actually cue safety for people who have marginalized identities, and also make sure that we aren't causing more harm by including strategies that might not be as effective.
I love that. Okay, I have one last question for you. From what you've learned around those kind of cues and the safety and feeling of belonging that it builds for those who are marginalized or often not even integrated into those spaces, what do you think is most important for all of us to think about when we think about those cues and actually, acting what we say within an organization or a space?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the answer to that is what you just said. It's the action, it's not just the words. And a lot of the conversations that you and I have had sort of draw on this as well. And the idea that diversity, equity, inclusion is not just a one-off conversation. It's a conversation that needs to happen every day and through all of the practices and structures, and thinking about pay and how you support people as entire individuals. And so it's not just a statement that you can have or one day training that you can have. It's really sort of a holistic conversation about how you can support people as whole individuals and sort of foster that safety within their identity, not just, one day, but every day and through all of the sort of practices within your companies and organizations.
Awesome. Thank you. I think those are some of the issues and questions, discussions that are happening in spaces everywhere right now. So it's exciting to hear what you're learning. So my name is Yeruwelle De Rouen, and I work specifically on trying to bring restorative, proactive processes into organizations and groups. So thinking about how we can reduce harm by first addressing it, but then similar differently to what Keturah is doing, thinking about how literally centering the equity, belonging, inclusion practices throughout policy, procedure, hiring, recruitment, retention, how we, through relationship and safety building and community, actually build the innovation and the kind of progress within our corporations and our ideas that we want to see. So something that I have found very interesting over the last several years is to watch the data that comes out about what we see the changes happening around diversity, equity, inclusion, or the inclusion of women within different spaces of work. What this looks like when we are actually breaking down the data and looking at it based on region and race and gender, things like that, so that we can start to see trends. And one of the trends that's been obvious to me and to many that pay attention is that not much has changed, right? No matter the amount of money that's put in over the last few years, we don't see from a quantitative perspective anything actually shifting for the better. And I guess I shouldn't say nothing, because there are data points that have shifted, but they haven't changed enough to make societal impacts where people are feeling healthier, happier, and more included within their spaces. We actually see people still fleeing those spaces. So I find it very just fascinating to think about the data that comes out about many of these corporations and companies, and then to see the corresponding data that comes out that says that many of these corporations and companies are the best place to work or the best place to be. So this seemed like a really cool opportunity to take so much of the discussion and quantitative data that already exists and to start to center it in qualitative discussion. So to look at what is really happening in many of these spaces, companies, corporations, and organizations, thinking from the perspective of leadership or cultural development, where people see that this is successful, but also where we see that nothing has changed and why. And what I think is important is to look at these lists of best places to work and to then correlate them and line them up with the data that shows us that their DEI efforts and their belonging efforts are failing. So how are we defining a best place to work? What does that actually mean in America, and who is it actually speaking to? And I think those are some of the big questions we have if we want to start to really unify and come up with a best practice effort within spaces of doing exactly all the things we've been talking about, actually creating them so people want to be in them that are not necessarily been welcomed before, have not had a presence, and are not looking to just, for instance, have a presence, but to actually participate in creating whatever is happening within that organization. So I was lucky enough to get to work with Keturah and to find correlating interests within our questions and work, to be able to come together and start lining these questions out, to think about how could we develop a white paper, an open source conversation that would start to talk about where, maybe I should say, give us some recommendations for what a best place to work would actually mean if we were to center this definition in actually creating healthy spaces and healthy groups of people together, and if we centered that in equity, belonging, and inclusion. And so that's where this has gone. We just introduced ourselves. Now we wanted to talk a little bit about the what, right? What are we trying to accomplish in gathering this research and doing this work together? So Keturah, I was hoping if you could explain just from your perspective what we were hoping to put out into the world and use this for.
Yeah, so through our research, both qualitative and quantitative, what we're hoping to do is to provide a list of recommendations for best equity, belonging, and inclusion practices. Through this work, we want to sort of look at, what are the best practices that people are touting in the world, but then through our research, sort of what are the things and the trends that we're seeing emerge, with the end goal being a concrete list of sort of practices that we can can put out into the world so that folks can utilize the information that we've gathered from our research. One of the ways that we're hoping to do that is through publishing a white paper that will allow us to sort of put that information out into the world, so that other DEI practitioners, researchers, people who do similar work can sort of see what we have done in collecting this data, and hopefully use it in practical ways. And part of what we're trying to sort of get at is understanding, in part, some of the terminology about using diversity, equity, inclusion compared to equity, belonging, and inclusion. And I know Yeruwelle, a lot of your work sort of speaks to that. So I'm wondering if you'd like to sort of talk about how your expertise and some of your work and frameworks sort of play into the conversations that we're trying to have.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the DEI versus EBI conversation will continue for a long time. And frankly, language is important, and hopefully we'll continue to develop into better language to get at what we really mean. But part of what we wanted to understand, coming from the work that I do already with organizations, is where we have been focused in organizations that tout as being best places to work, where they have focused on having diversity of identity and where they have possibly put money into those diversity initiatives, but where we don't see that they have created with their work environment or with their employees actually an engaging, equitable, inclusive, and belonging space. So the difference that we're really looking at is, one, to help name that difference, right? Where do we see that there's DEI versus EBI efforts, and what are the outcomes that are different? But also to understand what it really means to center in trying to build equitable spaces where people belong, are reflected, are empowered to participate. And so then the outcomes or the innovation or the products that are developed are also more innovative and diverse and varied because they are meeting more needs and including more perspectives. So that was one piece of what we're focused on. Another aspect of that framework discussion is really getting closer to the discussions of power dynamics, right? So thinking about domination versus partnership or collaboration. Where within DEI and EBI does that fit into shifting power, right? Are we just, again, asking for more representation of identity, of skin color, of gender? Or are we actually looking to include the perspectives, experience, and expertise of those people, meaning that, again, we have totally different outcomes in the way that we work together, the way decisions are made, or the way that we collaborate and bring people's information together to make decisions. And I think lastly, some of the framework that we've been using to help us understand what is happening is to also think about where within the, again, the title of equity, belonging, and inclusion, does restorative process and proactive process show up within that culture or within that organization? So stepping beyond who we're hiring and thinking about how, when we bring those people in, are we proactively understanding that there will be lack of clarity or conflict, right? That there might be disagreement or different beliefs or opinions, and how do we build in systems that are going to engage those and actually understand what's happening in the immediate, what's happening in the world, what's happening for our employees, and how to bring all of that together as we make decisions and move along within our work. So that has been, I think, what's been part of the interesting discussion, to look at where we can see DEI data around identity and people at workspaces and leaving companies, and where we can actually start to go a little deeper and think about what kind of culture was being built, how people were included and elevated within that culture or supported, and if they weren't, where there was an opportunity for that possibly could be taken advantage of in the future.